In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Komamura battles Bambietta with his new transformation, Masked Masculine returns to face off against new enemies, and Ichigo seemingly completes his training with Ichibei. Episode 17 of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Heart of Wolf, is another solid entry in the second core of our anime adaptation. I don't think it's quite as good, bombastic, or as exciting as last week's episode, but this one is a slight change of pace by design. It's a much more downbeat, dour, thoughtful, and emotional story this week, focusing in on a character who is often overshadowed by many of his contemporaries and even lampooned by vast swaths of the fanbase. But this week, or for at least half of it, Komamura's time to shine, and the focus on his choice, his sacrifice, and his fight makes this episode feel very memorable. Truthfully, there isn't much else like this to be found in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Of course, there are plenty of emotional moments to come, plenty of great fights to come, but Komamura's suffering as a result of his thirst for revenge and the way his story closes in such a Pyrrhic fashion is powerful viewing. And so, let's get on with our in-depth spoiler review of episode 17, Heart of Wolf. As always, I'll be looking at the episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I must say an enormous thank you and give a huge shout out to everyone supporting me there over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Now, as always, we need to start things off by looking at what's actually been covered this week, and it's a fair bit, especially in comparison to episode 16's roughly 3 chapters or so. But in keeping with Core 2 so far, it's also a little bit all over the place as well, and of course there's some new content to contend with too. So, in terms of chapters this week, we have quite the laundry list, so settle in. We've got chapter 555, The Hero, chapter 556, The Wolf's Bane, chapter 557, Left My Life Behind, chapter 558, Heart of Wolf, which of course is the episode's title, chapter 559, The Night Right, and finally chapter 560, Rages at Ringside. So that might sound like a dauntingly long list, but it's actually slightly deceptive, as half of those chapters there only have a small portion of their content covered in this week's episode. For example, although the episode technically covers chapter 555, it only really covers the final 4 pages or so, completely skipping all of Ichigo's scenes, as we expected since he's currently still up in the Royal Palace. This is probably the biggest story change in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc's second core so far, how they're handling Ichigo and how they're actually giving him a visible journey to go down, much like they did with Uryu in the first core. This is vital in my opinion. The journey is often just as important as the destination, and it's great to see how both Ichigo and Uryu end up in their respective positions by the time they potentially come to blows in a few episodes or so. The same goes for chapter 559, which had some of its content showcased last week, some of its content showcased this week, and based on what we've seen in this week's episode, some more of its content will be in the next episode to come. And again, the same goes for chapter 560, which funnily enough is actually the title of next week's episode, Rages at Ringside. In this episode, we're only really covering the first 5 pages or so of that chapter. The main focus this week is definitely squarely on Komamura versus Bambietta, but there's plenty else happening as well. With the current pacing of the arc, it's not enough to simply have one singular focus per episode, outside of hopefully the tentpole fights to come. one of which is maybe coming next week. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves, so let's crack on with the spoiler analysis for episode 17. The episode opens with a truly blink and you'll miss it shot of Shinji standing before a torrent of ruby red power as Bambietta activates her Vollständig from chapter 554. We're then treated to a couple of brand new close-ups of other Sternritter activating their holy forms across the battlefield. While these fly by quite quickly, I managed to capture shots of each of the Quincy in question. The Sternritter we actually see activating their power are Sternritter N, Robert Akatrone, and Sternritter U, Nana Najakoop. I love how they're both surrounded by officers and how their power swallows those officers up in an immense blast. It helps show why these forms being released was so terrifying at the ground level, rather than just never seeing any of these Quincy again after 554's cliffhanger. Also, Robert's Reiatsu is a nice aqua light blue, the amended colour from Core 1's Blu-ray release. Meanwhile, Nanana's Reiatsu is orange. We also see a purple beam activate close by, which could be somebody like Asnot or Pepe perhaps, and then we get the same shot of the other holy forms from last week. What's interesting is that the lime green column is surely being produced by Candice Catnip, but there isn't another holy form being activated right next to her, so where's Giselle's column of power? Speaking of which, we skip over the vast majority of chapter 555 now to reach that shot of Candice's wings resonating with the other holy forms and springing out behind her. I said it last week, but I want to reiterate, I really do love how the holy forms look in the anime. They are so colourful, and they are just stunning to look at. But yeah, we get a new shot of Giselle also using her holy form. The skeletal bat wings look absolutely fantastic, but in the source material we didn't see this form until much, much later. Interestingly, Candice has a halo here, but Giselle doesn't. Giselle's line about how Candice can now use Vollständig, implying she was the last to be able to, is removed here. The remainder of this sequence plays out the same as the rest of the chapter, with chapter 555 ending on the ominous shot of Bambietta in her Vollständig. Things have been moved around slightly though. Shinji has already been defeated by this point in the original chapter, so the cliffhanger in the source material has Bambietta surrounded by fire from her explosions, not by her own Reiatsu. Once the opening is finished, we then double back on ourselves to slightly earlier in chapter 555. Bambietta emerges from her pillar of light as Shinji comments that everything is still reversed for her in a new line. However, before he can even finish, he's of course detonated in a massive explosion, sending him flying, bringing us to the opening of chapter 556. As he hits the floor, Bambietta launches another bomb at him, sending him flying again, bringing Shinji's successful run to an abrupt, inevitable end. Bambietta then reveals her Shrift, the Explode, and destroys the surrounding area. I think the way the anime portrays her power is very effective. The blinding, flashing red lights as everything is engulfed in a brilliant fireball is impressive to behold and really helps showcase how dangerous and powerful she is, with such immense and seemingly unfettered power at her fingertips with which she can bombard the battleground. As Shinji lies defeated, Bambietta smirks at the sight of Komamura, who returned from heading towards Silburn to defend his allies instead. Thankfully, Hinamori's small sequence is left untouched here, giving her a small chance to do something as she leaps towards Bambietta. Now, as I speculated in my battle analysis, Hinamori draws her sealed Zanpakuto and transforms it into her Shikai without calling its name, which ordinarily would mean she's achieved Bankai. But I wonder if it's just an oversight here, as I suspect it was in the original chapter. Bambietta's line in response to Hinamori jumping her is ever so slightly changed. In the anime, she calls Shinji Smirky Face, but in the source, she calls him the one who's dead over there, so I wonder if it was changed to avoid confusion about his fate. Komamura leaps in, rescuing Hinamori and avoiding another series of blasts. As Komamura tells Hinamori that she was reckless and her Tobiyume can't deflect the bombs, Bambietta appears behind him, leading him to swipe at her with his Zanpakuto. Now, a part of me has a feeling that this video might not actually be that long thinking about it, as this fight is adapted very faithfully to the source material with very few extensions or real changes at all, but we'll see. As Bambietta slings another bomb towards Komamura, his inner monologue about how he believes he can deflect the bomb with his armor in the instant before it detonates is removed from the episode and instead reappropriated into Bambietta's explanation in a moment. As Bambietta goes on to explain her shrift to Komamura, the anime makes his transformation very obvious, as we see a clear shot of not only his arm, but a totally human hand as well. In the source material, the transformation is hinted at when Komamura places his hand on the ground. Here, however, it's not quite so overt. You can see that he does seem to have exposed skin instead of just fur, but the fingertips of his black gloves are still intact in the source material, making it not quite so clear that something is up. As if that earlier shot wasn't enough, we then get another close-up of Komamura's totally human hand when he places it on the floor in that aforementioned scene. I absolutely love the shot of the bombs raining down from the sky. It's a genuinely beautiful visual, like a colourful firework of death raining from the air. And after the smoke clears, Komamura's human form is revealed in a shot that's identical to the art from the source material. Now, in my opinion, as I've said before, this is one of the biggest reveals ever in Bleach. I audibly gasped when I saw this back in the day. I remember it so well. Now, I am a fan of Komamura, so maybe that had something to do with it, but still, this is wonderfully handled here in the source material. Here in the anime, I think it's interesting and actually rather cool the way they've chosen to go about this. Rather than making this a shocking twist moment, the anime makes it not only understated, but also eerie as well. As Bambietta looks upon Komamura's new form, there's no expectation of triumph here. The soundtrack choice is absolutely perfect. A solemn, strange, ethereal sound that plays over the top as Komamura glances up at her. It helps to hammer home the notion that this form that Komamura has taken means there's no way back. And just speaking of it like that makes me even happier that they showed Komamura has been single-mindedly focused on reaching Yhwach until he realised he had to return to rescue his friends. But it makes it clearer that this version of him was not meant for Bambietta, it was originally intended for the Quincy King himself. Komamura's flashback showing his conversation with his grandfather is kept mostly the exact same, as is, like I said, the fight itself. It's a shame that there wasn't a little more added to this conversation, as questions regarding the Beast Realm and Komamura's werewolf clan have been some of the most pertinent ever since this chapter was first released, but unfortunately we don't gain any more answers here at all. Nor do we get to see any of Komamura's fight with his grandfather. The little shot of Komamura glancing down at his hand is cut from the episode, but Komamura's explanation of why he feels the need to avenge Yamamoto's death is of course left in. Plus, in the anime, we get a new shot of Komamura actually going to pull his heart out, which is really awesome. To be honest, no matter how things turn out for Komamura, I have always loved this moment, and I love that we get to see the point where he makes his decision. I love that he is unsure about going through with this at first because of what it must mean for him and his fate, but he resolves that he has to do it anyway to avenge Yamamoto. I love that. Giving him the agency, the conviction to make his own choice, to make his own mistakes, is a really wonderful thing for a writer to do for their characters. Giving Komamura that option to make his own choice makes him much stronger as a character. It makes him a proactive character as opposed to a reactive one. This is reinforced, of course, by the fact that Komamura is the one who sought out his grandfather in the first place. What would make Komamura a reactive character would be him doing nothing and his grandfather coming to find him and telling him, you need to learn the human transformation. But Komamura actually going and seeking it out himself, and then, despite knowing the ramifications, choosing to go ahead with it because he feels such a burning desire to avenge Yamamoto, makes it such a stronger character moment, in my opinion. It's handled well in both the source material and here in the anime. As we return to the present, there's a really nice new moment where Komamura tells Hinamori to take Shinji and leave. Firstly, this is good because in the source material, Hinamori and Shinji just kind of totally vanish at this point, despite the fact that in this moment, she and Shinji should still be right behind Komamura when his new form is revealed. He told her to get behind him, and it's unlikely she would have moved since then. Secondly, it's cool that someone actually gets to see Komamura in this form. I have to wonder if Hinamori will say anything about it to anyone, or if she will simply keep it to herself. But the next time we see these characters won't be for a few episodes now, unless they get a new scene in the meantime. As Komamura goes to release his Bankai, he has a new line where he says that he has no choice, which is interesting. I presume he thinks Bambietta is just far too dangerous to leave alone now. The release of Komamura's Bankai is slightly extended here in the anime, giving it a much more dramatic reveal, which interestingly kind of puts it at odds with the way Komamura's transformation was revealed. At the end of chapter 556 in the source material, Komamura's Bankai simply appears in its new Dangai Joy form, shedding its familiar armour all at once, as though it's rising up and bursting out of it at the same time. Here, though, the original version of Kokujo Tengen Myo stands tall and rigid behind Komamura, as if awaiting his final command. I actually really like that we get to see this version of his Bankai one last time. It adds a nice bit of connective tissue for Komamura's character between this arc and the previous ones. I think, though I'm not sure, but this version of Komamura's Bankai is still hand-drawn and 2D. It's only once the new version is revealed that it becomes a 3D generated creation. Speaking of which, Komamura then shouts the new name of his Bankai, and the armour cracks and explodes off of it, shattering to the ground. Honestly, this slightly new way of revealing his power is very cool and adds another layer to the twist in a more, like I said, dramatic way. A more dramatic way than Komamura himself was revealed, which is interesting. As the eyes of Komamura's Bankai ignite with life, we begin chapter 557. So let's talk about the Bankai for a moment. Obviously the Bankai is rendered here completely in CG, which means that it both looks and feels different to the world around it for the most part. It's engaging with a 2D character in the form of Bambietta, and there was always a chance that it could ruin this fight, especially since Komamura's Bankai is essentially the main component of the entire battle, as opposed to just showing up briefly. I'll be honest though, having seen it a few times, I don't mind it at all. Would I have liked to have seen the Bankai in 2D? Yeah, of course. I used to love how Kokujo Tengen Myo looked back in the day. There were some wonderfully drawn shots of it that gave it an immense sense of presence and power. For example, when it was summoned against Po in the Fate Karakura Town battle. And I'd have liked to have seen how they would have chosen to portray Dangai Joy in that same vein. That being said, whether intentional or not, there's something truly unsettling about Dangai Joy in its current iteration that works very well. It is jarring. It is moving at what seems like an almost different speed or frame rate or something to the rest of the world around it. It's sluggish and weird, but I think that's cool in the context of its appearance. Remember, this is supposed to be wrong. The appearance of this Bankai is evidence that Komamura is going down a path that perhaps he shouldn't be. The appearance of his human self, as indicated by the strange, wistful music that plays when it first shows up, is not natural, and that feeling is reflected upon the Bankai. This is not supposed to be a moment of glory and triumph for Komamura, but a moment of resounding sadness, almost, of him resigning himself to not only his fate, but his choice to chase revenge. The CG helps to reinforce, I think, that this is a strange, otherworldly, ethereal monster. It isn't supposed to exist, so I think it works well. So chapter 557 begins as Komamura's Bankai swipes at Bambietta. This fight plays out almost identically to the source material, with Bambietta escaping the blast and trying to hit Dangai Joy in the face, only for it to defend itself with its hand. As its hand is blasted apart, it reforms slowly. The next sequence is slightly altered, however, as Komamura says that Bambietta's techniques can't defeat his Bankai. In the source material, it simply reaches forwards and kind of slams Bambietta into the ground before she blasts her way out of its hand and flies off into the sky. In the anime, however, the Bankai begins stomping towards her in what's a genuinely terrifying moment. Imagine this thing running at you like that as it picks up speed before trying to grab her out of midair. It's a bit odd though, as surely Komamura should be running as well, but I'm pretty certain he just stays in the same spot the entire time. I have to say, I absolutely adore the next new sequence. It's a long, single-take shot showing Bambietta zipping around the giant and launching bombs at it from afar, as it both tries to grab her and strike her with its blade, as that mournful music begins to build into something slightly more epic and fitting for a fight. It's really fantastic, and it shows you the absolute scale of the battle, and I think the scale of Komamura's Bankai is actually handled very well in this fight in numerous different shots. When you see how massive Dangai Joy is later on, I'm really surprised everyone didn't just stop and stare at the ongoing battle. It's odd to think about the other Bambis who must be watching this unfold. How would Komamura have fared if they all decided to join in and help Bambietta? Would he still defeat them with ease? Or would it have been too much to deal with before he ran out of time? Bambietta continues to bomb Komamura's Bankai as he explains why she's unable to defeat it, as another blast exposes the gaping hole in his chest. I love that as soon as Komamura says he can't die, Bambietta flees. It's the same in the source material, but here you get a great close-up of her terrified face in the anime as the Bankai leaps up behind her. Now, admittedly, this is an epic moment, but it's also an unintentionally funny moment to me as well. The fact that Dangai Joy jumps into the air and then somehow just hangs there long enough for Bambietta and Komamura to finish their conversation, as well as Komamura just standing there holding his blade in place to finish talking, is just kind of funny to me. But I do love seeing the way human Komamura is continuously getting covered in smoke. It's a great way of showing and not telling that Bambietta is furiously continuing to blast away at the Bankai to no avail. And as we reach the end of chapter 557, Komamura gets his amazing line, another of my favourites of the arc, where he says that as soon as he stepped foot onto this battlefield, he had left his life behind, as he brings his blade down and finishes the fight. The cataclysmic final spread of 557 is wonderfully adapted here, with Dangai Joy striking Bambietta and causing a massive pink fireball explosion which we see from 3 separate angles in a really epic moment. It's a very definitive end to the fight, and I always enjoy that. Starting up 558, we get a brief shot of young Komamura as his blood runs down the side of the dish holding his heart. His grandfather notes how proud of him he is, but again, as I mentioned in my battle analysis, there's something unbelievably sinister and shadowy about this character, and that is only reinforced here in the episode. The character's voice is excruciatingly ominous, and he feels like he has an ulterior motive as he seems to revel in his grandson's suffering and sacrifice. But we'll get there in a moment. For now, there's another absolutely stunning shot to behold as Bambietta looks on in horror at her own bombs being forced back into her by Komamura's Bankai. This is just an absolutely beautiful sequence, full of colour, and is a great example of the anime vastly improving on the source material, which honestly looked a little empty back in the day with 2 massive panels showing very little in regards to the blast itself. As Bambietta sails towards the ground, Dangai Joy lands on the floor with Yhwach and his palace in its sights. This sequence is extended a little bit, and I love it. The shot of Dangai Joy rising up in the distance is brilliant. Again, it helps to emphasise the scale of the creature, but also highlights the line of sight between it and its goal. It's very foreboding, seeing its burning eyes from afar, knowing that it is coming across the city to reach the palace to finish the job. I only wish that it had at least made it there. Komamura takes a few steps forwards, lurching through the darkness in yet another of my favourite shots, a new shot at that. Komamura himself is completely obscured by the shadows, driven by his lust for vengeance, the massive giant following behind him. Like I said, these brief, lumbering steps forwards are new, but they add so much to the haunting atmosphere of this whole sequence. But Komamura collapses to the ground, and his Bankai follows suit, shattering into a million pieces. This sequence feels more earned here in the anime than it did in the source material. In the original chapter, we always wondered why he wasted time with Bambietta if he only really had time for one fight. But now in the anime, there's additional context, and in a way it feels even more tragic. Komamura gave everything to destroy Yhwach, but his good-natured heart forced him to turn back. I wish personally that we'd seen maybe a little more of that decision-making in real time. Komamura is staunchly loyal, but imagine seeing him torn between reaching the castle and between helping his friends who were suffering in that moment. Imagine if for a flicker of a moment Komamura's desire to avenge Yamamoto was getting the better of him, but he was at last able to pull himself away and go to rescue Shinji and Hinamori. And in a way, all of this makes his punishment even more brutal. Komamura was barreling down the path towards revenge, but he overcame it in choosing to stay with Hinamori and Shinji instead. And while that desire still burned in his heart, he still did make that positive choice to help them first. So his ultimate fate does come across as harshly unfair, maybe even more so this time around. I also love the tiny new detail of Yhwach smirking at him. While it's mostly just a bit of superfluous flavour, I adore the added spitefulness of the whole scene, and it really makes Komamura stand out as someone acknowledged by the Quincy King, even if only in failure. The artwork during this sequence, particularly of Komamura himself, is extremely good as well. Watching Komamura struggle to get to his feet, only to collapse again, and then fumble with his blade, only to grip it once more in defiance, is very powerful. And as if to hit the emotional notes even harder, the anime plays Soundscape to Our Door during this sequence, one of the most famous pieces of emotional music in Bleach anime history. Thanks to the way this all coalesces so successfully, this sequence evokes older Bleach, more so than almost anything else so far, and not only is it painfully nostalgic, it's masterfully handled. Komamura's ultimate fall from grace is sad to watch, especially when juxtaposed with those brief images of him as a young man. His grandfather continues to seem villainous, or at the very least manipulative, as he wallows in Komamura's anguish, lapping up his heart. His grandfather's talk of continuing to live on, of sipping on Komamura's black resentment for his own nourishment, feels very literal, and I do wonder if the grandfather has some kind of parasitic relationship with those in his clan, that he goads into following their so-called true path of revenge, giving in to their original sin and accepting their punishment just to keep him alive for a bit longer. The way this sequence comes to an end, with Komamura collapsing and the music becoming little more than a deafening silence, is again very hard-hitting. It still feels like too great a price to pay for what Komamura did, especially since he realised the error of his ways. And as we've discussed before, was it even wrong? Yamamoto was the only person to grant Komamura sanctuary despite his appearance, and after Yamamoto was killed, Komamura swore to avenge him. Is that so evil? It just seems very natural to me, whereas Tosen's quest for revenge led him to both betray and try and kill those who had once considered him friends. The two are not the same, and while Tosen died as a result, Komamura's fate is almost just as bad, as evidenced by Kubo drawing him a memorial piece of art this week. But Iba arrives in Komamura's moment of defeat, as if to reassure the fallen captain that he did nothing wrong, that actually he was in the right despite his divine punishment. I really do like this moment, and I love seeing the two of them continue to march towards Yhwach's palace in solidarity. I wish the anime had lingered a little more on this moment, in fact, and allowed it to breathe before cutting to the information card, maybe ending instead with the shot of Komamura's eye that's removed here, but regardless, it's a touching moment of poignant reflection. I only hope that moving forwards the anime doesn't completely forget about Komamura and remove him from the equation entirely, as happened in the source material, but for now, we leave the 7th Division here. As we start the second half of the episode, we're treated to a brand new scene that I was very happy but also somewhat conflicted to see. We see the remains of Toshiro's ice prison on the ground and Kang-do buckled over in the centre. By activating his holy form, he was able to free himself, but he seems to be out of breath and at least in some kind of shock. It's a big shame, and a huge missed opportunity that we don't see his holy form here. His wings could have easily just disappeared much like Giselle's did earlier, and so it seems like we'll probably never see it. As he collects himself, however, a black shadow appears beneath him and Uryu emerges from the darkness. As we then move across the city, we see BG9 kneeling on the floor. He's seemingly healing himself, which isn't something we knew he could do in the source material. He notes that he's repaired himself to about 45% of his full health so far, but as he does so, a shadow appears beside him, from which Uryu emerges again. In a fleeting shot, you can see an unconscious Kang-do lying on the ground inside the darkness. Oh, and just like in the source material, BG9's injury is now on the opposite side of his body to the last time we saw him, which is the kind of mistake that I just don't understand how it makes it into an adaptation like this. So, what is going on here? In the source material, after the activation of their holy forms, we don't see Kang and BG9 again until they're both executed by Hashwolf for their failure in chapter 559. Now, that chapter is covered in this episode, but their execution is not. Instead, the anime adds this connective tissue, which shows Uryu collecting both of them, presumably to answer for their failures. We see that he's even managed to go so far as to knock Kang out, and I wonder if Kang actually tried to fight him or not. Either way, they're presumably both being escorted back to Silburn. It's well documented on this channel that I've never liked either of their fates, as they seem nonsensical for an army leader to make, but I'll admit that this does actually make things a little bit better. Sending Uryu to forcibly collect them shows that the Vandenreich has no tolerance for failure. Presumably they knew they only had the one shot, and losing in battle means they get collected up and killed. I still think it's weird though. BG9 definitely unquestionably lost, but Kang-do was unharmed and Hitsugaya collapsed on the brink of death, while Rangiku, for all intents and purposes, was actually dead. So is that really a loss for Kang-do just because he was frozen? So I'll admit that even with the added context, I do still think this is really dumb. I mean, think about it. It actively incentivizes Sternritter not to get into fights, because if you lose one of them even marginally, you're going to be collected and killed. Askin made absolutely the right decision to bail on his battle with Mayuri. Had he lost, he would have been picked up and executed. Instead, he just avoids fighting anyone, and somehow that works out even better for him in the end. Meanwhile, there's Bambietta. Carrying on with the end of chapter 558, we see her lying in a smoking crater on the ground. While still really messed up and sadistic, what happened to Kang and BG9 actually goes some way to explaining Giselle's actions here. The Bambis reach Bambietta first, but we can assume that Uryu was on his way to her, probably in a matter of minutes. In doing so, Giselle zombifies Bambietta, allowing her to continue fighting with them in her own sick way, and crucially, sparing her from Hashwolf. Though why Giselle didn't just heal her like she does later to Candice, I don't really know, as she does outright kill Bambietta here anyway. It's just she gets a corpse to use as a puppet as opposed to not, I presume. I really like that Uryu is the one being sent to collect the fallen Sternritter. It makes him seem really ominous, and just gives him something extra to do during the second invasion. Interestingly, the cliffhangers for both chapter 558 and 559 have been cut from the episode, both of which feature the returns of Rukia and Renji to the battlefield. And then as we reach chapter 559, some of this chapter was incorporated into last week's episode, the start of the sequence involving Master Masculine. For now, we return to Kyoraku and Nanao's confrontation with Hashwolf, which has been ongoing for a few episodes now. This plays out essentially identically to the source material, with Yugrim destroying Nanao's barrier before she then activates a second one. I really like the new addition of seeing Hashwolf's Quincy Reiatsu flaring up around him as he prepares to smash through the second barrier. Now interestingly, in the source material, an actual tangible summons appears behind him, telling him he needs to return to Silburn. Here in the anime, however, he seemingly just somehow knows that it's time to leave, and no explanation is actually given. There is an interesting new line, though, where he tells Kyoraku to be sure to thank Nanao, presumably for holding him off for so long. I want to emphasise this again, but the actual character art in this adaptation has been very strong. You only need to look at the shot of Kyoraku telling Hashwolf they'll have some tea waiting for him to see how closely the team is trying to emulate Kubo's own art. And for me, the extra effort is absolutely worth it. We then return to the battle with Mask Demasculine, and again, most of this is new content. In the aftermath of their fight from last week, the Shinigami notice the disappearance of both Bambietta and Komamura's Reiatsu. I really love Hisagi rushing to Komamura's aid. It shows that they have built up a bond over their shared conflict with Tosen, and it also shows that yes, this is a battlefield with multiple things happening all at once at the same time. Though I am a little surprised they could even sense Komamura's Reiatsu at all, since the Quincy landscape was reportedly so dense with Reishi, a trap set up by the Quincy themselves, that the Shinigami had real trouble sensing each other at all. However, before Hisagi can leave, we see James crying over Mask's downed body. Honestly, James is so damn strange that I can't help but love the concept of this extremely weird character. His voice is hilarious, but I also love that Ikkaku actually points out that he's just a tiny little old man. However, James's cries revive Mask, and he quickly defeats the three of them, finally bringing us back to chapter 559, where he slams Hisagi into the ground for a 3 count. And so, as we predicted, Hisagi now knows the truth to fighting Mask, which he will tell his captain next week. This brings us to the end of chapter 559, where 2 lights explode in the sky and come shooting downwards, except here in the episode we don't see the cause of them, as I mentioned earlier. We then finally reach chapter 560, with Mask rushing towards the landing zone of those 2 lights after James urges him to do so. However, as he does, Hisagi attempts to stop him with Kazushini, leading to one of his many beatdowns in the arc. As Mask prepares to stomp on Hisagi's head, Kensei arrives in the same manner as the original chapter. This moment lacked a little of the impact it had in the source material, I think. There doesn't seem to be as much weight behind Mask's foot, and I really enjoyed the fact that Kensei was shadowed in his first appearance initially. But it's still a low-key, very badass and creative entrance. As an aside, while it's great to see Mask getting all these new scenes, I kind of wish Asnot was getting the same treatment, as we are rapidly approaching his major fight, and then after that it's over for him as a character, so it's a shame that he isn't getting any extra scenes either, unless they start popping up next week. Anyway, the confrontation between Mask and Kensei plays out mostly the same, with Rose appearing behind him as well. At the arrival of 2 captains, Mask leaps backwards and challenges them both in a new moment. Kensei says they won't take up much of his time, which is from the chapter. However, at this point the episode comes to an end, setting the scene for the remainder of 560 and beyond next week. However, as we've come to expect by now, there is another post-credit scene featuring Ichigo. I think the way they've handled Ichigo's training has been very smart. By relegating it to the post-credit scenes, not only does it feel special, but it also separates it from everything taking place down below, and it gives us the opportunity to see all these new scenes with him without interrupting the flow of the source material playing out in the battle itself. Ichibe explains that the immense weight Ichigo feels is the weight of that which he is trying to protect. Ichibe explains that everything Ichigo has seen are everlasting memories and revelations. In other words, the power of the king. This would lead you to either believe that Ichigo was in fact using the Almighty, though it's strange because the Almighty lets you see the future, not the past, or what Ichibe is talking about here is that Ichigo was witnessing the power of the king, everlasting memories and revelations of the king's power, of seeing him splitting all of the worlds. Images suddenly flash past once again, this time overlaid beneath a single image of the Soul King's actual eye as we know it to look. These images now include shots of the original war between the Shinigami and the Quincy 1,000 years ago, further reinforcing that everything is leading up to this. As immense strands of differently coloured Reiatsu pour into Ichigo as he staggers forwards, Ichibe wonders if he is is a vessel capable of withstanding that power, or will he simply shatter? And once again, all of this talk of vessels and withstanding the Soul King's power really makes it seem like Ichigo is being prepped to be a Soul King replacement. At this point, Ichigo screams, his eyes once again reflecting those of the king as the Reiatsu around him becomes black and white. As his body warps and inflates with power, the wooden sword he's holding gleams a brilliant heavenly light, before suddenly everything vanishes, returning Ichigo to his normal self, albeit heavily weakened and tired. Again, what is happening here? Well, I'm going to release a video later this week diving into these segments specifically, but let's take a look here at the end of the review as well. It actually seems, for once, fairly straightforward to me. As we speculated before, those colourful streams of Reiatsu must represent the 4 different spiritual races: Shinigami, Hollow, Fullbringer, and Quincy, and of course each of them is found within Ichigo. But they are also found within the Soul King. They stem from the Soul King himself, the first and ultimate progenitor of the world. And so when the Reiatsu strands combine and become black and white, I think that's quite literally the Soul King's own power being pumped into Ichigo to see if he's capable of withstanding that much strength, hence why his eyes reflect the Almighty once more in that moment. Just in the same way as Yhwach will eventually absorb the Soul King's power and it will take the form of a black, liquid-like substance, that's what we're seeing here as well, though presumably a more controlled fraction. How this is happening, I don't know. It's possible this is all happening with the Soul King's blessing, but as I said before, the main vessel of the Soul King sees the Shinigami as his enemy, so why would he help unless he's being forced to? I still think the way Ichigo's body inflates and bubbles is a reference to the surplus of power that leaks out of Yhwach when he tries to absorb it all, and it becomes the strange army of eyeball monsters that then try to engulf the Seirete. But perhaps what we're seeing here is that unlike Yhwach, Ichigo has the capacity to withstand and absorb it all if necessary and keep it contained. Ichigo wants to protect the world. He wants to protect his friends, his family. He wants to protect all 3 worlds from being collapsed into one by Yhwach's ultimate goal. And so, to truly understand the magnitude of what it means to want to protect the world in its current state, and to literally and figuratively feel the weight of that responsibility, Ichigo sees and bears witness to the creation of the world as we know it, and the sin that enabled it to happen. That's why Ichibei says the weight he feels is what he wants to protect. For now he's seen so much, and he feels an immense weight now that he knows where the world that he wants to protect actually came from. That's just my speculation for now. Like I said, there will be a proper video coming on it soon. As the episode ends, however, and Ichigo crosses beneath the final Torii Gate, I'm very happy to see Senjumaru's palace, which I wasn't expecting, although again, I kind of wish it wasn't completely soaked in one bright hue. Anyway, with Ichigo's arrival here, which again is totally new, he's now visited each of the 5 members of the Zero Division, and it makes sense that Senjumaru would be last, despite the fact that she appears before Ichibei when Renji and Rukia journeyed through the palace in their source material. The poem for this week comes courtesy of Rose, which is cool, and it reads, "The heavens resound with deceit, the captive heart dances to the melody." This is a cool, but again, pretty straightforward poem, I think. It seems to just be describing the ability of his upcoming Bankai, Kinshara Butodan. And next week, episode 18 will be titled Rages at Ringside. So that's it for episode 17, Heart of Wolf. It's another really solid episode as we hurtle through the second Quincy invasion. I think the way they've handled Ichigo's new scenes has been really good, making real genuine use of those post-credit moments. I hope we continue to dive deeper into the Soul King's history a bit later on. Right now, this just feels like a tease for much bigger revelations to come. Now, I mentioned at the start of the video there would be spoilers for the entire arc, so hopefully you've been mindful of that as we've continued onwards, but I'll reiterate it again for this next segment. There will be spoilers for the entirety of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. And before we move on to our predictions, we actually need to revive an old segment from the first core, Sternritter in Memoriam. And the first Sternritter to die in this core is Sternritter E, the Explode, Bambietta Bastabine. Now, of course, she will return later on as a shell of her former self, but she is killed here by Giselle in this episode. You could argue that she's technically alive as a zombie, but Kubo drawing her a memorial artwork is good enough for me. So Bambietta gets the unfortunate and dubious honour of being the first Sternritter to fall in this core, though there will be plenty more by the time this set of episodes is out, trust me. In fact, I think we'll probably get a few next week. Speaking of next week, before we go, let's take a look at some predictions for the upcoming episode. Personally, I think the episode is likely to open with the execution of Kangdu and BG9. This will be our final chance to learn BG9's Shrift. If we don't get it here, I will be genuinely disappointed, because it's just such an easy thing for them to do. It doesn't make any sense that it wouldn't be in here at all. It's possible that straight after this scene we'll see Rukia and Renji actually arrive, perhaps watching them appear from a different angle. Maybe Uryu sees them dropping down from afar or something. After this, I think the episode will basically run all the way until the death of Mask de Masculine in chapter 564. A part of me thinks the anime might do a little more to highlight the fact that James is the actual Sternritter. Whether that's through a tiny flashback or just a more overt confirmation from Yuha Bark, I don't actually know. We'll have to see. We're also close now to chapter 565, Godlike You, some of which was showcased at the start of episode 14, at the beginning of the core, so I wonder how that will be adapted. It's likely to be here in some form, but I wonder if they will add some new sequences to make up for what was taken out and put at the start of the core. A small flashback to a younger Yuha Bark would be wonderful to see. Then there's Ichigo. His timeline is already completely out of whack now, as he was meant to have begun his descent to the Seirei before Bambietta fought Komamura. So it's possible we either won't see him again at all now until he makes his way down to Seirei, at which point there might be a flashback to the events of 555 we missed, and it kind of has to happen, I think, as the moment he talks to Kisuke on the phone as he flies down was in the original teaser trailer. Or we could even open next week with his meeting with Senjumaru. Or perhaps the most obvious option, it will just continue to be the post-credit scenes moving forwards. Either way, I'm excited for Senjumaru to have more time to shine. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below on episode 17 of the 1000 Year Blood War arc, titled Heart of Wolf. Did you enjoy this episode? How did you like it in comparison to the previous three? What was your favourite moment? Do you think they handled Komamura's sacrifice well? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Do please let me know. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And until next time, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.